Okay, we're out doing a little bit of field work. We're out in West Orange, New Jersey, and I wanted to spend a bit of time exploring New Jersey. It's a beautiful May day. It's really hot in Philadelphia. It's in the mid-90s, and so we wanted to actually go down to the shore. And so next up, we're going to be visiting Fort Hancock, which is out on Sandy Hook, part of Gateway National Park in New Jersey. It's a armored fortification, but first we actually wanted to stop and take a look at the Thomas Edison National Historic Site. So it's behind me. You can see the lab there. We've decided not to go in because we really have a lot of things to do today, and they want $15 per person, the National Park Service, to go in, and there's not even any guided tours or anything. So I think we're going to take a pass on going inside today. But I wanted to give you, and we also tried to go up to see his house, which is evidently in a gated community that you can only access if you have this special $30 pass. So we decided just to take a pass on that. So we've got the labs behind us, and it's really important, the idea of what's happening with electricity and magnetism and photonics and communication and sound and film. And all of these things tie in with the work that was done by Edison and his giant corporate structure, General Electric, which had one of the first industrial research facilities, not here, but in Schenectady, New York. And but this is where I'm close to. I'm close to New Jersey, so I decided to come out and talk about this a little bit here. Now, Edison was born in Ohio, I think Milan, Ohio, and he spent some of his childhood in Port Huron, Michigan. He was he was a homeschooled kid. Evidently, he was in school for a while and he didn't do well in school, and so his mom, who was a school teacher, taught him. At some point, he lost a lot of his hearing, I think due to maybe scarlet fever or something. They don't know why, but like as of the age of 12, he lost a lot of his hearing, which is interesting because a lot of his fortune was made in the phonograph industry, right? And so in sound recording. And when he was like in his early teens, he saved a kid in Michigan from being run over by a train, and his father, who was in charge of the train station, hired him on to learn how to do telegraph work. This is in the early it was in the early 1860s, and then it was during the Civil War era. And so he became like a tramp telegraph operator and traveled all around as a teenager, learning how to do telegraph work, and then eventually moved to Boston and tried his hand at telegraph work there and inventing. And I think he took a job, it was like a night job so that he could do experiments because it was quiet and there wasn't a whole lot going on. And he had spilled some acid and burned a hole in the floor of his employer's office, and then at that point they were like, no more of that. But he invented supposedly an electronic roach killer and an electronic voting ballot counting machine that no one was interested in. And then he decided at that point to only put his time into things that were that people were interested in paying for. And so one of his first successful inventions was actually the stock ticker. And I think that's really important because later on, General Electric, in addition to its work in electricity and batteries and lighting and electrical-based media and weaponry and later computing, also got into finance and was one of the early industrial banking systems. So the fact that his first successful invention was a stock ticker was pretty significant. So he came out here to New Jersey to manufacture these and do other inventions. And actually, I'm going to stop for a second and move on to a little bit further down the block. But the very first film studio in the United States is here in West Orange. The original one, which was built in the late 19th century. I'm not sure if it was like the 1890s, I think. It was in operation for 8 years and then it was torn down. It was pretty much like just a wooden paper shack that was on a revolving pivot and had an opening in the ceiling for light because the film production needed a lot of natural light. But the early silent short films were filmed here. So I'm going to walk down. That structure was called the Black Maria, and it's quite an unusual name, but evidently they called it the Black Maria because that was the name of paddy wagons and they thought that it looked like a paddy wagon, but I don't know why paddy wagons were called Black Marias either. So I'm just going to pause for a second and go down and show you what that looks like. Okay, so in the distance there you can see this little tar paper building. That's the Black Maria. It's a replica. Again, the original was torn down, but it has that sort of area that's jutting up, and that was to let the sunlight in for the filming. And the early films, again, they were short films. They were working on developing the celluloid to be able to do the motion pictures. They were quite short. They were often a bit like they were silent, and they were almost episodic. So they would show things like a blacksmith working, or somebody washing a baby, or someone sneezing. They were very short clips, and then eventually they created a place in New York City that you could pay a small amount of money, and these were called kinescopes, and you could pay the money, and they would have 5 kinescopes, so you could see 5 short films, and they were incredibly popular. And it's interestingly enough that among the films that were shot here were performances, I guess, that were connected to the Buffalo Bills Wild West show, including a buffalo dance and a ghost dance, which again are not authentic because these were people who were performing as part of a spectacle show, but that there would be interest in the 1890s in having those recorded on film is quite interesting to me. And so just as far as timeline, again, you can see we're on the other side. This is the water tower, the Edison water tower, and then you can see the buildings themselves. Edison came out here in the 1870s, and 1877 he first worked on the cylinder for sound recordings. The first recording was Mary Had a Little Lamb, and evidently the proceeds from the sound recordings, the cylinder recordings, and then eventually the phonograph recordings are what really helped him get his fortune. Now, which is interesting because he had lost a lot of his hearing. And then in 1878, the following year, they started working on the electric light bulb, and 3 or 4 years later, they finally had a bulb that would last 13 hours. And then in 1882, Edison created the first power station for incandescent lighting in the city of New York. So that's sort of the time frame. And then in 1892 is when he established his the General Electric Industrial Center up in Schenectady, New York. And he did that with the backing of J.P. Morgan. And then there was another person by the name of Coffin, Charles Coffin, who had been working in shoe fabrication, but then eventually helped take over a local electrical company in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and expanded. He was very successful in expanding electrical plants in the South, not just for lighting, but also electric streetcars. And as somebody in Philadelphia, I know, like, we had initially the first streetcar systems were horse-drawn carriages, but then eventually those became electrified. And so the early electric systems were for both lighting and the streetcar systems. In 1901 in Schenectady, they had the first industrial research lab there with General Electric. And so, Edison, he married twice. His first wife, he had 3 children, and then she died, and then he had a second wife. They had 3 more children, and they moved to this Glenmont estate that we can't see because it's in the gated community that you need a pass to get into. And during the 1890s, he spent a lot of his time trying to figure out how to use, I don't know if it's using electricity or using the other inventions he had to separate out iron from rock ore. And that didn't work very well, but we know that there are a lot of other interests in other parts of the world using electricity for extractive industry purposes, including Schlumberger in France and then later in Texas. So that was interesting to me. In the 1900s, he worked on electric batteries that were primarily used for railroads and mines. And then during the First World War, they made a lot of money in working with the Navy on weapons systems. So I'll continue talking about that in a minute. Okay, this is just to give you a sense. This is some more of there's a big fence around the whole site, but The wheels there, that's from the first electric railroad that Edison was involved with in the 1880s. It's part of his research lab that's now the visitor center. And then there's this sweet little house front, historic house front here. It's a National Park Service site. And again, the Edison National Historical Park, and then this is the site itself. Okay, so we're here at the visitor center area for the park, and I just want to sort of finish up by saying a few more things about General Electric. In 2020, General Electric was the 33rd largest company in the United States by revenue, and it was even larger like 10 years, like in 2011, but they divested themselves of a lot of their financial interests in some other divisions. So in 2021, they announced that they were changing their business structure and focusing on 3 specific areas, which are aviation, renewable energy, and healthcare, interestingly enough. So I think it's really important as we understand electronics being increasingly nanoelectronics and nanomachines, and how that's going to integrate with the Internet of Bio-Nano Things and smart computing and performative prescribed wellness behaviors and digital monitoring of our bodies and our social reactions, that's really significant. And also with the renewable energy, the aspects of piezoelectric energy harvest and human piezoelectric energy harvest, and how that fits into everything. So I think, I'm not sure, I haven't had a chance to look into the aviation aspect of it. At this point, it seems clear that normal plane travel is not going to be the primary business model, that it's moving towards sort of on-demand and drones. So I'll need to look a little bit more into that. But I want to mention too, in World War I, Edison was working very closely with the US Navy, and there was a lot of technological and industrial improvements made at that time that increased the killing power exponentially. The weapons that were in the gases, and you could kill a lot of people fairly easily with these new technologies. And so Edison, even before the U.S. entered the war, was involved in pushing the military to do R&D around innovation, around military defense innovation, and was on sort of a board that was advising the Navy. He developed a lot of ideas. Evidently, he had a special ship that he was used as a testing lab, both for camouflage of ships and for detecting radar. And as we know later, the work that is being done around frequency and radar waves is really, really important. So that's part of the story that we need to be paying attention to. And ultimately, the Navy didn't do a whole lot with the recommendations that Edison made. I think he made 40 recommendations, and they prototyped them, but they didn't do much with them, and that was very frustrating for Edison. But once you understand how much of the nanotechnology, biotechnology, these other programs are coming through the Office of Naval Research, essentially Edison jump-started that whole process during World War I. He was involved in sort of really pushing the U.S. Defense Department into pursuing R&D, putting government money behind R&D, and doing that within a public-private partnership arrangement where private labs, like his own lab, would be involved in developing these new weaponry and defense systems, all of which are then later commercialized, right? We know that you create war, and then you develop the technologies, and then you commercialize those technologies, like rinse and repeat. That's how it goes. And last few words about here at Edison. I was looking back over my notes, a couple of things that I wanted to mention regarding General Electric. The individual who encouraged Edison to set up the industrial lab in Schenectady, his name was Charles Proteus Steinmetz. And Charles Proteus Steinmetz was essentially a brilliant mathematician, and he was from Germany and had socialist leanings, eventually came to leave Germany and at the rise of the Nazi Party, and came to work for a competitor of General Electric's, and General Electric later bought them out. But Charles Proteus Steinmetz, his focus was on alternating current and something called a magnetic hysteresis and lightning, and he was really interested in how lightning worked as well. And he was called sort of like the wizard, the wizard of GE, and the maker of thunderbolts. And that was, and there was quite a bit of rivalry going on at the time between regular current and alternating current, and the Edison's approach, and the alternating approach, and Tesla, and sort of Steinmetz was in all of that. I believe he won a Nobel Prize, and one of the other Nobel Prize winners for General Electric, his name was Irving Langmuir, and Irving Langmuir was a chemist working in Schenectady whose focus was on cloud seeding and weather modification. And so as we move forward in understanding the whole climate narrative and what's happening with weaponized weather, it's important to understand that the use of chemistry and electronics and magnetism in natural systems, and that sometimes weapons are not the way we imagine. The weapons are not necessarily cannons and guns and bombs, but could also be weaponized natural systems, and that's something that Langmuir was connected with. And just in closing, I've been spending some time reading this book. It's another Oliver Reiser book. It's called The Alchemy of Light and Color. And he talks a lot about the nature of reality and our senses and understanding how do we determine what's real, right? Is it what we see? Is it what we hear? Is it what we touch? We know that things exist beyond our ability to sense them with our five senses, and how does that work? And then how we imagine our understanding of reality really shapes society, and then society shapes what is accepted as reality, right? And I think we've lived through this for the last couple of years. Is social systems are sort of reality is collectively agreed upon, what is real and what is not real, and those people who lie outside the common understanding of what is real then become framed as other, right? And that dynamic and how that dynamic works. And I think this is really relevant because if we understand our senses, what Edison was doing with his research into electronics was taking what we know of our senses and transmitting it into a digital format, into an electronic format, whether that was an electronic format of sound on cylinders or on records or later on radio, because I forgot to mention General Electric developed RCA after buying Marconi Electric. After the First World War, the US government took over all of the radio stations during World War I. And so after that, General Electric acquired Marconi and became RCA, and then later became NBC. So there's this through line of electronics and the way in which our perception of reality is shaped through how we perceive electronics. So at the beginning, what they were doing in the Black Maria box was literally transmitting scenes of life, which what we would consider reality, whether that was a cockfight or somebody washing a baby or somebody sneezing. It was a real normal thing, and then putting it onto film. But then increasingly, the film media was able to create stories that were beyond real life, right? And whether those were, through later film, through special effects, through other things, we could tell stories that wouldn't happen in what we currently agree as reality. And yet it exists in reality within the digital world, right? And so now, in the early days of the silent films, you would pay a tiny amount of money and you would get you and the kinetoscope and you would see it. It was a one-to-one communication, and then that communication became a projection and you projected to a room full of people. And now we're moving back towards one-to-one communication, but the communication with the digital media is tuned to you, right? Tuned to how you think or how they want you to think. And so our senses of what is real and what is not real are starting to get blurry. And in the metaverse, really, it is like living in a hallucination. And are we going to all collectively agree to live in that hallucination, right? That is the metaverse. That is a hallucination that is largely guided by defense research, right? And it has been since the beginning, since Edison was working, with the US military in World War I. So I just want to take a minute to read from this book, because I think it is helpful, and not everyone is going to have a copy of this book. So in the light of understanding the role of Edison and reality and recording reality through sound and visuals and transmitting it back, and then making reality through sound and visuals and sharing it out, and what the differences are, and then what happens once we actually come to inhabit digital spaces through mixed reality. So let me see. So he's actually talking a little bit about Alice in Wonderland here. Imaginative scientists have summed The Alchemy of Light and Color by Oliver Reiser. Vision and Reality. Imaginative scientists have sometimes amused their readers by surmising how the world would appear to human beings if they had a different set of sense organs, or if their receptors were tuned to respond to frequencies to which they are now insensitive. Since in man, the eye, the organ of vision, is the most important receiving apparatus of the body, these speculations frequently take the form of theorizing about how the world would look if our eyes were differently constructed. That the world would appear quite different is easily shown. Bertrand Russell begins his book on the ABC of atoms with these lines. To the eye or to the touch, ordinary matter appears to be continuous. Our dinner table or the chairs which we sit seem to present an unbroken surface. We think that if there were too many holes in the chairs would not be safe for us to sit on. However, science compels us to accept quite a different conception of what we are pleased to call solid matter. It is, in fact, something like the Irishman's definition of a net, a number of holes tied together with pieces of string. Only it would be necessary to imagine the strings cut away until only the knots were left. Mr. Russell unfortunately does not tell us why, if matter is so porous, chairs are safe to sit upon. I venture the statement that is so because we use in the sitting on the chair is made of the same sort of stuff, or rather the stuff is approximately the same order of density and texture as the substance upon which is sat upon. An electron is, especially if in rapid motion, would probably find the seat of a chair quite permeable. If human beings were made of stuff as heavy as that astonishingly dense satellite of the star Sirius, they would probably experience great difficulty in keeping from falling, not only through the chairs, but almost everything on Earth. Furthermore, our eyes are also made of approximately the same sort of stuff as the things we see through our eyes. But if we were equipped with eyes capable of ultra-microscopic vision, we might see through many things which now seem quite solid. With such eyes, the smooth tops of tables would resolve themselves into mountains and valleys. If, like Alice in Wonderland, we could control our size by eating mushrooms, we might reduce our size to the point where we would stub our toes on atoms or fall in love with electrons. Perhaps we could also see the sunlight in cucumbers, which, according to Swift, philosophers of a certain country were trying to extract. It is really there, botanists now tell us. And on the other hand, if we were giants larger than the one whom Voltaire imported from Sirius, we could regard the Milky Way as a small but rather hot grain of sand. Such excursions into the two infinities of the universe, the infinitely little and the infinitely big, are quite outside the range of actual experiment. Another line of speculation is open to us based on the probable experiences of actual organisms. Thus, it seems natural to suppose that insects see better over small areas. In any case, they probably don't see very much on the macroscopic order. We, on the contrary, have a much wider purview of surrounding space, but we don't see as clearly as we would if we had lenses with the magnifying power of microscopes. Perhaps the price we pay for seeing so much is that we see so little of the little things. Moreover, as we are told by Dr. Ladd Franklin, the eye has undergone an evolution, which means that the more recent types of visual experience which occur in us cannot occur in the lower organisms. Undoubtedly, these animals, lacking some or all of our color sensations, must see the world in quite unique ways. So now, if vision has evolved in the past, why should it not evolve in the future? Just as there are living creatures capable of hearing what we may call super audible sounds, so there are probably creatures capable of seeing what for us is super invisible light. If the human eye should someday be granted the ability to see in the ultraviolet region of the spectrum, interesting consequences may follow. All substances which emit the ultraviolet light which is now invisible would then appear to be surrounded by an aura or halo. And thus mercury, which I have been told gives off an invisible emanation, would then be surrounded by a glowing vapor. Perhaps we would also see human bodies enveloped by some sort of penumbra, as those persons allege who claim the gift of clairvoyance. Such speculations may seem to possess little practical value, but they become of great theoretical interest to the philosopher. They serve to loosen up our all too ossified habits of thought, and they also lend plausibility to the reality of the problem which the metaphysicians call the problem of reality. What is the real world? Such speculations as we have just indulged in makes it clear that the world as it appears to us is largely the product of our sensory equipment. That the external world is our set of reactions is indicated by the experiments of Stratton, who wore spectacles reversing the ordinary spatial orientation of the external world and found that he could just as well get along after the first readjustments. Poincaré has also suggested that the world we live in is property of the distribution board in the brain. This is the idea that our habits of thought are built around our sense experiences and follows from the fact that the eye is a projection of the brain itself. The way in which this perceptual world prejudices our world of concepts is pointed out by Bergson. If one were so minded, as I now am, one could concoct still more bizarre ideas by following the line of thought. We recognize certain types of experience as being unusual. We call such experiences hallucinations and delusions. Instead of giving us the truth about reality, we suppose that they are the products of a disordered mind. And when we incarcerate the insane persons in institutions, we apply the test of accepted social standards. A sane or normal person is one who conforms to the standards set by the average man. The norm is established by what the majority sees and believes. But let us suppose, for reasons Mr. H.G. Wells might give, that the insane people increase in number to the point where they outnumber the sane. That in time, we would not be able to control them. What would happen then? Perhaps they might put the so-called sane people into institutions, and they themselves, being now in the majority, would run the government. The first measure they would probably enact would involve a substitution of their test for the test of sanity formerly in vogue. And now if the test of sanity is a social test, these maniacs, whom we formerly held to be victims of hallucinations and delusions, would then possess veridical experiences. The relativity of insanity must follow from any view in which insanity is regarded as a set of responses rather than as a thing in man produced perhaps by obsession. Something like this happens in the cases of insane persons who are simply geniuses in advance of their times. The way in which the abnormal may become normal is seen in the fact that unless we are subject to certain common illusions, we are really abnormal. But hold on! Some objects, a set of maniacs could not run the government. Or someone objects, a set of maniacs could not run the government. They are incapable of social cooperation and legislation. In reply, I may point out that perhaps we exaggerate the extent of cooperation among sane people. I wonder whether a set of lunatics could have made a much worse job of international cooperation than we sane people who came so near to exterminating civilization a decade ago. The subtlety of the problem can be indicated by the following conversation between a mathematician and a professor of abnormal psychology. The one said to the other, "You psychologists are always studying illusions. You live your whole lives in a world of false ideas." The reply of the psychologist was this: "Did it ever occur to you that what you call truth is only a delusion so deeply rooted that you haven't been able to bring it up to light?" And at this point in the argument, someone is likely to demur and point out that the test of reality is not solely a social test, but others are also applied. True, it will be granted when a man sees pink elephants or snakes in his bed, of the existence of which he is skeptical, he appeals to his friends, and if they see them also, his faith in the validity of his own perceptions is remarkably strengthened. But collective hallucinations may sometimes occur. Group hypnosis can be produced. Descartes considered the idea that a malicious demon might be misleading the whole human race into believing that there was an external world. Certain religious skeptics have even supposed that the alleged miracles of the New Testament, such as the resurrection, were due to group hallucination produced by suggestion and self-hypnosis. Since this is possible, we must bring in the other tests. If we see something, the existence of it, which we doubt, we must also try to feel it, and thus one sense is used to supplement and check up the other. But in reply, may I point out that this does not give us absolute certainty. Why should we put more faith in touch than vision? We sometimes see things we cannot touch. The mirror of a pin is a case in point. The mirror image of a pin is a case in point. To explain away the image by appealing to the principles of geometrical optics does not finally dispose of the matter. There are too many tactile illusions and too many unfelt realities to test the whole case on touch. It has been pointed out that sight is simply anticipative touch, and that they both give us only relative truth. The upshot of this whole matter is that we must conclude that what the world is, aside from the way in which we perceive it, or the way in which it appears to us, we do not know. Only a God or a philosopher can tell what the ultimate reality is. And we have heard much these last few years concerning the psychology of philosophy. What we need now is a philosophy of psychology. Instead of attempting the heroic task of pursuing the absolute on a grand scale, let us restrict ourselves to the problem hinted at in discussion of the evolution of vision. We saw that what we perceive is a function of our sensory equipment. And now, how did the senses come to be what they are? By passive adaptation to an eternally fixed environment of external nature. But isn't it also true that the environment was created by those sense organs as they came into existence? Doesn't the eye create the light it sees as truly as the light builds up in the retina which responds to it? And if so, which preceded which? Frequently, the glib use of terms, organism, and environment sloughs over the certain very baffling problem. Rather than try to answer such profound questions in general terms, let us turn to a specialized phase of the problem of color vision. Here is an excellent opportunity to come to close grips with this problem of the relation of the subjective and the objective. And so, thank you for staying with me through this reading. I hope maybe you see the connection, because, you know, the inventions that Edison made with electronics, and also General Electric more largely, and later because General Electric went very deeply into computing and avionics and defense, is what is our reality, and how do our relationships with technologies, especially electric technologies, shape our perception of reality. And knowing that they're currently working on things like optogenetics, where they introduce light and frequency waves into the neurons of the brain to actually engineer memory, thought, social relations. How does that happen, right? And is that something that we should be pursuing at this point, and being pursued in the name of progress? Because that was sort of the absolute command of Edison, was this intense need to progress and to invent and to make. But, and I'm not here to argue against the electric light, but society changes, right? When you start to see the world outside of the cycles of the sun, that creates a different kind of society. And then ultimately, the trajectory of that society may very well be that we all live in the metaverse, right? And we live under an artificial sun, or maybe no sun, or engineered weather, or skies that happen in a digital box, right? That Black Maria, what a name, the Black Maria, the film studio, right? Like, to me, there's something about that box that feels a lot like the metaverse, right? But they're gonna paint it in a beautiful, like they'll make it look like a Disney castle and welcome us in with like a red carpet, but really it's a tar paper box, the metaverse. So I'm gonna take a minute. There's some dandelions here, so I'm gonna leave a little dandelion offering before we go on to our next stop. All right, so here's our little offering again. We're at the base of the lab, and there's these trolleys. It says, the truck of the second commercial electrical railroad locomotive built by Thomas Edison and operated with the freight and passenger cars over 3 miles of railroad in Menlo Park. And then underneath, I put a little bit of an offering. You can see it's a bit under the shade, but that is a heart that someone from British Columbia in Canada sent to me, and it says courage, heart, courage with heart. And I brought some offerings that I had, some cedar and a feather and a shell, and I believe that's some wood from our Utah trip, and surrounded by dried dandelion, which someone had lovingly sent me earlier, and I've been having it for tea, but I wanted to leave some here as well. So, and of course the dandelions themselves. So that's the offering here. So we're sort of grappling with electrical existence. And thanks for staying around. So I made a spectacle enough of myself that they actually gave us a pass to come see the house in the ground. So we just pulled up, but this is Glenmont, Edison's home. It's on a hill in this sort of gated community, Llewellyn Park, that overlooks the lab area, and there's quite a spectacular view of the iris here. So this is the house. It's a Queen Anne sequoia pile. I think it's like 25 rooms or so. Beautiful rhododendron. So this is, we're under the porte cochere, and this is a stained glass window, and I don't know if you can see, but it actually has like an Aladdin lamp and a burst of light in it. It looks like it's sitting on books. So that's kind of interesting. So there was a plaque on the door that said that building, the room that's over the porte cochere, was Edison's thought laboratory. that space. And then there's like quite a lovely sun porch on one end. So this is the back side. Lots of chimneys. It said it was built between 1882 and 1883, and he lived here until he died in 1931. And this whole area, it's like 13 acres. The house evidently isn't open anymore. I think COVID has essentially killed off any sort of supplemental, this is a national park site, any kind of supplemental tours, now it's deadly to try to go and do a cultural event in a building anymore, so they've just probably laid off all the staff that does that. But it's quite beautiful from the outside, and clearly they've been paying a lot of attention to the grounds. There's some nice cannas and white iris in the garden. Okay, so this is the back end of the house, and we walk down this little path here, and it goes around to the burial site of Thomas Edison and his second wife, Mina. I think his first wife, Mary, died after the birth of 3 of their children, and evidently Mina was born in Akron, Ohio, and she was involved in the Chautauqua movement, and they met at the home of like a family friend who was an inventor, and Edison taught her Morse code and then proposed to her in Morse code, which is kind of interesting. You can see here the rhododendrons and sort of the Chinese lanterns on either side of the burial site, and we have Edison 1847 to 1931, and then we have Mina 1865 to 1947. So she was 18 years his junior, and it's interesting. So this is Edison's tombstone, and at the top you have this seashell carved sort of in laurel wreaths, but there's the pearl in the shell is like the yin yang, the polarization, which is quite interesting to me. I don't know that I've seen something like that before. And then Mina's is sort of a more typical sort of crown and cross. That's Mina. So and beautiful rhododendrons. So just one more thing about Mina. She, at some point, the Edisons established a second home down in Fort Myers, Florida, and they were close with the Ford family and also the Firestone family, I think, too. And so they were very interested in botanical studies, and they had these greenhouses, and they were trying to come up with rubber substitutes for the war effort. And so there was a lot of civic activity in Fort Myers, Florida, and Mina was involved in that, in addition to sort of the Chautauqua movement, also around environmentalism and sort of other public issues that women of her day would be involved with. So that's pretty much it of the estate. One more panorama. Again, the grave site, and again that decoration with the shell and the pearl with the polarization, the yin yang, is very interesting, and the grounds, which are in pretty good, well taken care of. They said there's 13 acres, and then the house itself. So they're right on the site where they spent, probably 40 years of their lives here in this beautiful area of New Jersey. I don't know if this will show up. This is a stained glass. It's probably on a stairwell, and since I can only see it from the outside, it looks like a female figure in a skirt. So I'm going to try to look up and see what that stained glass is of, because it's a very, very large piece. I would say it measures probably at least 3.5 feet by maybe 6 feet. And again, just to emphasize, the building's being closed, right? Please find out, go to the Park Service to find out some CDC guidelines. We're like 2.5 years into this, and I think at this point we need to understand that our cultural heritage, this perpetual pandemic state, is being used to justify ongoing austerity that's gutting the cultural heritage access to our country. It's not okay.
Compression ratio engine, 4-cylinder, to a relatively higher ratio V8.
All right, we're in Edison's garage. 1908, you said? 1908?
The building is built in 1908.
The building is built in 1908. This is, in the background there is the original charging station, and what Edison did was he made the electric batteries, is that correct? So not the cars themselves, but we were talking about the difference. This is an electric car that would have retailed at, like you said, the equivalent of like $3,000 versus the Model T Ford that took 3 kinds of fuel, and that was like 300, did you say? So yeah, so you can see like the luxury brand. Now Edison didn't do the car work himself, but it was the batteries that were the thing, but they were also used for the streetcar railroad. So we're in here, again, it's this concrete building. It's in really good shape. It's pretty amazing. They said the only thing they had to do when they were restoring it was like knock off some flaking paint, and that it's made out of a patented kind of concrete. And this chunk of concrete down there is from Yankee Stadium, and Yankee Stadium was made up of this concrete as well. And so when it was torn down, they donated some of that to the site. So again, I mentioned before about Mina, that they spent time down in Fort Myers, Florida with the Ford family. They were all very close, the Fords, the Firestones, and the Edisons, and you called them the vagabonds?
They were the vagabonds. They often camped together around the United States, and on occasion they'd stop by and pick up a president.
Yeah. A president, did you say?
Yeah. Several U.S. presidents would stop by and accompany them partially on the trips. They had a good time.
Yeah. And they were doing some work down there as well, right? Like in terms of like research stuff?
They would stop and do some research along the way. And also they would conjure up projects that they could do together, jointly.
Yeah.
As you mentioned earlier, artificial rubber was one of the projects they did.
Yeah.
Edison also tried, unsuccessfully, unfortunately, to put an electric starter in the Model T.
Oh, okay.
That was done by another gentleman at the General Motors plant. I'm trying to remember his name, Charles Kettering.
Okay.
Who was another famous inventor of that period.
We have a gas pump, and you were saying that like even in the 20s in areas where rural had no electric, they would have manual hand cranks for the gas. So the gas was everywhere. And we were just talking a little bit about electrical sources, and I was mentioning piezoelectric because there's a lot of interest now in human piezoelectric energy harvest, like these wearables, like coming up with all these fantasies.
This reminds me of what happened in the 70s when the oil embargo hit. The late 70s, early 80s was a bubbling cauldron of new ideas. I remember looking at, when I was at Public Service Electric and Gas, I looked at so many different energy sources, and we tested a variety, fuel cells, energy storage devices. We were just testing everything that we could get our hands on and trying them out. What's fascinating now is that just as electric vehicles are starting to make another resurgence, I read just the other day that people, desperados if you want to call them that, are cutting the cables of Tesla charging stations, rendering them inoperable. So you're starting to get vandalism.
Well, there's all sorts of unintended. I just had our catalytic converter stolen last week.
Your catalytic converter?
Yeah, because they're stealing all the catalytic converters for the minerals. So
I heard of that. I heard of that.
These things, it's a blessing and a curse, the automobile for sure. So, well, we're going to head on. We're going over to Sandy Hook to see the Arsenal stuff out there. So that's our next stop. But yeah. All right, so we just drove down about an hour from the not the Bell Labs, the Thomas Edison National Historic Site. And we decided to come to Gateway National Park. This is the Sandy Hook district. This is in New Jersey. And we're up on an elevated viewing platform at the end of this peninsula. You can kind of see a little bit in the distance, the distance of Brooklyn and Queens and the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, I think. And this is all a wildlife management area here at the end. So, but it's surrounded by ruined gun emplacements for target missile practice. And there's a beautiful, I don't know if you can see it, there's a osprey flying too around us, which is pretty awesome. And egrets and birds, but it's very wild down here. The base was closed. This is a military base, Fort Hancock, and it was closed in 1972. So everything has sort of grown back over as a ruin. So I'm going to go back to, go back down and show you some of this, but it's quite amazing. The hawks and the birds, and there's a lot of poison ivy. There's a lot of poison ivy. It's a baking hot day. This is like the first day in the 90s here this summer, and for May it feels a lot like August. But it's a fascinating place. I think that there's a $20 per car fee between Memorial Day and Labor Day, but we just got in under the wire on that, so we didn't have to pay anything to come in. And it's quite exceptional. During World War II, this Fort Hancock was occupied as a town of 7,000 people. And you can see a little bit behind me, there's a water tower and there's some buildings. And so we're gonna get a bit closer in to see that as well. But this entire peninsula is strategically important for the security of New York, and they knew that in the 18th century actually. And there's a lighthouse that aided with navigation of ships up into New York Harbor. And so by 1814, the government, I don't know which, if it was the state of New York or the federal government, had acquired this entire 6-mile peninsula and kept it for strategic purposes and of navigation and defense of the port of New York. And so it's quite it's beautiful. It's amazing down here. So I don't really have great words for it, but I'll show you a bit later what's going on with the gun emplacements. And I think for a while in the First World War they might have done some radar research, but later the Signals Corps was moved to Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. All right, and this is an example of one of the ruined gun emplacements. And eventually, they used it during the late Spanish-American War and I think the First World War. And then the guns got so big that they couldn't really shoot them here anymore because they didn't have the distance from things that they would end up destroying. And so then after that, they moved to Aberdeen. And I'm not sure, I guess that the guns were up on top, and then maybe the armaments were stored below in these sort of locked boxes. Yeah, so you can see that this is called the 9-gun battery. We were on the observation deck watching the Osprey, but the impact of the military on the environment is huge. And we just had, that small one that we showed you, but they go for really a long ways. And there are many of these on the end of the island. And nature is in the process of reclaiming them. Yes, more things closed because of orange readings, COVID, whatever. Now that just means that we're not allowed to have any access to any public parks anymore. But this is the lighthouse. This is the Sandy Hook Lighthouse. This is Sandy Hook, New Jersey on Fort Hancock. But actually the building itself dates to the late 18th century. And it was guarding New York Harbor since 1764. So originally it was fueled with whale oil, and then later I guess maybe some other kind of oil, kerosene, something, but they had later the Fresnel lens in this. One of the first lighthouses in the country to have a Fresnel lens. Mortar battery, concrete. Curious what this looks like. Looks like you can walk into it a little bit. Oh. Wow. See, it's like ruins. Lots of lichen. I guess probably the rails to bring the heavy munitions in. Gun. So if you're in the greater New York area, or northern New Jersey area, I would highly recommend poking around here. It's can't go much farther than this, but it's quite an interesting excursion. Okay, we're here on Fort Hancock. These are all mothballed barracks buildings from the Second World War. There were 7,000 people stationed here. All the buildings are pretty much mothballed right now. At the end of the peninsula is a modern Coast Guard and Homeland Security base, but these are all empty. The only thing down here right now is pretty much beachgoers, people who are connected to the Coast Guard, and there's like a small sandwich shop. But the building behind me was the building that was the home of the Women's Army Corps while they were during the Second World War. And the idea was that any of the sort of desk jobs or civilian types of jobs that were being done by male Army members, that they would have civilian women brought in, members of the Women's Army Corps, so that the men would be freed up for combat duty. And so this is one of the buildings that's pretty much falling down, and a little bit of stabilization to hold the bits up. But I'd heard that after Hurricane Sandy came through, that pretty much this peninsula became an island and there was a lot of damage. But this seems to be the worst off building. Most of the rest of them are in still salvageable shape. And you can imagine, just as assets, right? Public assets, they should be taken care of, but they're not. They're not. So, you know, who knows? We don't have a very long time horizon for taking care of things or making them available to the public, right? This whole area was a military base, and, you know, the government is holding it, and, you know, but for what purpose?